This is Brass Tactics, policy and strategy for the people, not the politics. Welcome to Brass Tactics.
Speaking of ships and pirates, I was reading today about a German Zeppelin that managed to take a Norwegian ship captive and capture it by rappelling down from the Zeppelin in the North Sea in 1916. I'm like, why haven't they made a movie on this? That is the coolest thing I've ever heard of.
A Zeppelin took a prize?
A Zeppelin took a prize of a Norwegian sailing ship in World War I.
Is that not what Iron Sky is about?
Isn't that the one about the Nazis on the moon?
Space Nazis, yes.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. Yes.
Welcome to Brass Tactics. Yep. So Pete and I have another a rare guest tonight, and that is our co-worker and friend Matt. Hello, Matt.
Hello, Joe. Hello, Pete. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Matt recently published the heaviest book that I have flipped through all year. Congratulations. Okay, what was the title again? I know what it's about. I don't remember the title.
Thanks, Joe. It's the Finnish Mosin from the three-line rifle to Ukko-Pekka. It's a comprehensive history of Finnish small arms development from the Finnish War of Independence in 1918 up till the end of the Cold War. And yeah, it's a hefty book. It makes a great doorstop at about 7 pounds.
It's a very, very authoritative volume.
A really nice coffee table book. You forgot to say that. It's got wonderful photos in it.
Got huge tracks of photos. But yeah, it's 584 pages, 20 chapters, anything anyone could ever want to learn, know about Finnish history, Finnish Mosin, Finnish small arms, Finnish accessories, slings, scopes, ammunition pouches, the whole like. And if you're not a complete and total loser nerd like I am, move on, keep on walking, nothing to be interested in.
Perfect for the casual Finnish World War II reenactor on your Christmas list.
We've all got one.
Indeed. So, this week, I don't know what we're talking about.
Well, there were two things. We could either talk the logistics, like the humanitarian pier operation in Gaza. I mean, I think it's interesting.
It's called JLOTS, Joint Logistics Over the Shore, and it is an integral part of force projection, which is apparently what this episode is about, despite the fact that I briefly Googled some numbers and facts and figures about the value of a soldier, because I was told this was going to be about the value of a soldier. But apparently this is National Prank Joe because he has a newborn and no sleep month, and we just gaslight him all the time.
I mean, I'm fine because I'm fine with doing both, dude, because these kind of tie in together. Like the necessity of getting a soldier all the way from his home to a foreign shore would necessarily tie in with how much he's worth, right?
No.
If I airmail a U.S. Marine across the planet, does he become more valuable?
No, because what you're creating is this. No, right. That's called the sunk cost fallacy. So no, because the implication is that our guys are worth more because we spent more to put them somewhere that they arguably should not have been to begin with, right? So that's just a sunk cost fallacy. So that's like, oh, well, we're over there now. We might as well stay here until we conquer whatever.
Well, no, I wouldn't say it's sunk cost. What if it's the fact that having to replace him costs so much money that he becomes inherently more valuable? Isn't that not sunk cost? That's just an investment?
No, it's still a sunk cost.
Yes.
An investment would yield returns. When you're saying, well, shucks, he's already over there, I'm in too deep, it's literally a sunk cost.
I think there's a cultural factor at play as well. I mean, we assign value to an individual within Western society, intrinsic value of each person. The figures I Googled before I did this was $250,000 enough just to train a private to get through basic training. Something tells me I couldn't find any figures in the Russian army that the cost of Ivan Conscriptovich is not nearly that much.
Ivan Conscriptovich, can we say that?
Yeah, that's generally accepted parlance. And when he gets promoted, he becomes Sergeant Mobitsky?
So how much does a U.S. Marine cost by comparison?
Oh, to a U.S. Army private? Ooh, that's actually a good question. Let's find out. Pull that up, Jamie.
Working.
I can tell you, though, according to the death gratuity payout from the Russian MOD, a dead conscript is worth somewhere between a sack of potatoes or a cord of firewood, depending on your province.
Sometimes onions. Sometimes
Yes,
you
you
get
can also sometimes get onions. The further you get from Moscow and St. Petersburg, the more natural the payout becomes.
sometimes it's fish. You get
Sometimes
fish.
you get frozen fish. Yeah, I saw some guys in Irkutsk province getting frozen fish. The ones in Moscow and St. Petersburg might get a lotta, which is, what, $8,000 to $10,000 new. So that's not bad. Not bad.
But they matter.
A lot of
No,
what?
a lotta. A car. An LADA car.
They die and get a car?
No, their family gets a car. It's their death gratuity.
So the typical range is between 11 and 44,000 just to get somebody through basic training for the Army. Granted, that doesn't include follow-on training, salary, everything else, but that's just your standard basic training. It does not include AIT, which would vary based on branch. People that are smart and go to Air Defense Artillery cost a lot of money.
Advanced individual training is
Yes,
what
correct.
AIT stands for.
Mhm.
And that's where first you learn how to make your bed in the morning and to be your best Forrest Gump and do whatever you tell me to, drill sergeant. And then you go on to AIT where they generally teach how.
I would bet, due to economy of scale, the Army's probably slightly cheaper than the Marines.
I would guess as much. And a standard Russian soldier, according to the sources I found, is about 200,000 rubles or $4,000. So we're looking about 1/10 the cost of an American soldier.
That definitely tracks. That tracks.
Which, if we go off death gratuity, the SGLI that a U.S. soldier gets is what, $400,000 typically. So in Russia, it's probably now it's maybe 1/100th of that, if that.
Yeah, about 4,000
Mm.
relative. Like, what is it? Earning potential or no, purchasing power parity, right?
Yes.
So like, yeah, $4,000 way out in Siberia is not much.
Which brings us to the cost of what does it take to kill a soldier, which I was also looking at that. And when you talk artillery shells, we like to think artillery, being the god of war, is cheap, so to speak. But right now, if you're looking to buy a 155, you're going to pay $5,000 on the low end. And that was before everything got crazy in 2022 when the prices went up. If you're just going to strap an RPG warhead to an FPV or a Mavic drone, $300 to $500.
Or even an F1 hand grenade.
Ooh,
Really cheap. You're really cheap.
What is an FPV?
A first-person view drone. So essentially, you've got a guy with a video game controller or a gal. No one says who you have to be to pilot the thing. And they see the view through what the drone sees, kind of like when you're in a video game and you go to the airplane view versus the cockpit view. You just see straight ahead, and they fly that into a target and kamikaze themselves, suicide themselves, impact themselves, however you want to call it, and make said drone as well as munition hit target and blow up.
We had 3 Ukrainian colonels come by for a panel yesterday, and they made a specific mention of the micro drones, the smallest, the first person view drones. There is almost no counter to them except not be seen, because when you're detected by another drone flying overhead, a larger drone, they will then direct or vector the FPV drones onto you. It's very like Fahrenheit 451 type thing, and these things are relentless because again they're inexhaustible. They'll operate as long as the operator is able to function and has drones available.
Typically, they travel at speeds of about 70 to 90 kilometers an hour. So about 65, 50, 60 miles an hour for us in the West and the U.S. And I have a friend of mine who's a territorial defense forces soldier fighting the Ukrainian army. Fellow friend of his was in the front lines near Bakhmut and talked about how over the space of 24 hours, his platoon was attacked by 30 FPVs, of which they lost several soldiers, WIA, KIA. They shot down a third of them. They shot down 10. They said that the Russian operators must have been very experienced if they could have shot down that many of them. Typically, they're not seen until they impact you or right before impact.
What are these micro FPVs equipped with?
Usually impact fused explosives. So either a modified hand grenade or an RPG warhead.
So they're essentially one single-use kamikaze drones?
Always. They're always kamikazes.
Okay.
You have different types of drones in Ukraine. You have bomber drones, you have recon drones, you have the FPVs, which are effectively suicide or kamikaze drones. And now both sides are beginning to experiment with other things like mother drones, they call them, or queen bee drones, where they will either have other drones that leave that drone to fly farther, or they'll have repeaters which boost the signal and allow them to operate another drone further behind enemy lines.
So the book recommendation coming out of this is going to be Chris Brose's The Kill Chain. It actually talks a lot about this guy. He's the current director of strategy, I think, for Anduril. But yeah, it talks a lot about these things. You're talking about the mother drone system, drone intelligence clustering, all of these different things. But going back to the earlier part of a conversation that we finally seem to have settled on at 25 minutes in, which is awesome.
Evan Conscriptovich.
Oh yeah, well yeah, but so how much does one of these FPVs cost?
$300 to $500, depending on the quality of the drone. And they've actually went away from American-made drones. The Ukrainians and the Russians have said that American-made drones are too expensive and not effective, and they're too easily jammed. So most of the drones in Ukraine are made in China. However, the Russians and the Ukrainians usually have their own supply chains. The Russians have went for a centralized command economy approach to building drones, where state tells said arsenal to build drones. They're all built the same. They all work on the same frequency, and they're all equally shitty. Whereas the Ukrainians have a number of different private industries as well as cottage industries, much like Japan at the end of World War II, where people are building these things in their houses and factories are spread out, which leads to greater diversification, but not as much quantity.
The similarity between the Soviet Union and Germany in World War II is very striking, actually, there.
Yes, the Russian drones have been bemoaned and mocked by their own operators because the Russian jamming will also often bring down their own drones at this time. The Russian drones are...
Sounds like some pretty effective jamming.
The problem is once the jamming changes frequencies, the Ukrainians are able to adapt more quickly. And plus, having private drones, you have industries like Wild Hornets is a big company in Ukraine that makes these. And they're always tweaking and modifying the design based on feedback. And if you're familiar with how the Soviet Union worked, they didn't really like feedback on how their weapons worked usually.
But if history's any guide, right, and the vast quantities of T-34s, evidenced on the Eastern Front, right, like quantity and the quality, all its own, as Lenin says. So just like with the artillery shells, the Russians are outproducing the Ukrainians massively with artillery and with drones. So eventually, as they get better, the balance will continue to shift. That's the fear.
Well, on that note of quantity as a quality all its own, it sounds like America is grossly overpaying for its basic soldier.
If you really want to be a pragmatist, you can look at the Russian approach and take conscripts out of prisons, just take your prison population, mobilize them, and send them to Ukraine. And then you're not paying them to be in prison anymore, and you're eliminating a portion of your population at the same time.
The antisocial elements.
That certainly does not jive well with the humanism and individual rights that America believes in. But at a realistic level, right? I think you start off by saying like net worth of our basically lowest ranks of soldiers is roughly $250,000 apiece.
I hesitate to put a value on it, but yeah, I think you're on the right track.
I'm not trying to put a price on a human life, right? But putting a price on that occupational niche itself, right? We invest about $250,000, and then we insure that loss for $400,000 minimum.
Right.
If you're looking at the soldiers group life insurance rates, right? For ammunition that costs $350, why bother risking that investment?
You've identified a problem that we have yet to take into account with the way that modern war has changed since the conflict in Ukraine, Joe.
Yeah, the race will be for automation.
That was a really solid soundbite, Matt. That does not answer that question, though. Very artfully dodged.
Not only soldiers' worth, right? So another thing that these Ukrainians mentioned is that because of the range of these drones and the fact that they are essentially uncontested over the forward line of troops, over the front line, there's a 20-kilometer wide, essentially no vehicle land on either side of the trench systems, because nothing can drive up to about 9 to 10 kilometers from the front without being seen and then destroyed by a drone or drone-spotted artillery. So the soldiers have to drive up at night dismount, and then run the rest of the way to get into their trenches before day breaks.
Which assumes that the other side doesn't have IR-capable drones, which are beginning to proliferate in the battlefield.
IR is just infrared sensor capability, so being able to see something without relying directly on the visible light spectrum.
They could see heat specifically, yeah.
So warfare has advanced so far that it's almost retrograded back into siege warfare, or the glorified version of siege warfare, which is trench warfare.
We're back in World War I at this point. If you look at the Russian turtle tanks that they began using, they're a tank that's completely encased in armored plate and sheet metal to the point where they can only see forward. It looks a lot like a tank from World War I, and that's to protect itself from drones as well as carry infantry and have more jammers on it. The idea being that the Ukrainians are so short on anti-tank munitions that if they attack it with FPV drones, which they're using as a substitute for artillery, it'll be able to get the infantry to the other side, at least keep them alive long enough to hit a trench line and then grab a toehold and gradually expand.
And the use of these penal battalions and Storm Z units by the Russians, which closely imitates 1917 stormtrooper tactics, right? Like little platoon company-sized attacks, bite, hold, and then using artillery support, expand it.
Don't forget the motorbikes and the ATVs that they've been using as well. They've had motorbike platoons and Desert Cross 1000s, which are basically Chinese golf carts on steroids.
So like cavalry units, essentially, completely unarmored, highly vulnerable, but at least mobile.
Very mobile, and the issue the Ukrainians have with them is that they don't kick up the giant clouds of dust or make the noise that the tanks do. And if they can close that gap between the lines more quickly, just like a stormtrooper in 1918, they can grab a hold on the defensive line, and then they can pour reinforcements into that area.
There is innovation happening, but it's just happening in reverse.
We're devolving.
I mean, I don't think it's a true devolution, right? Like it's still using sophisticated weaponries that keep getting more sophisticated. As we've talked about before, I don't like the term revolution, and this is why I don't like the term revolution, because everything still looks the same.
Deja vu all over again.
Right. We've returned to trench warfare because there's some basic fundamentals. There is some sort of underlying universal laws of military physics, of strategic physics, that somehow will always still apply. And trying to figure out how to leverage that better is going to be next. But going back to the meta narrative here, which was the cost of the weapons and the cost of the people using the weapons, at a realistic, pragmatic approach, right? Wars are just not going to be worth fighting anymore. If they're not worth fighting at all, right?
That's a fallacious assumption, man, because it's always been understood since Napoleonic warfare that wars have become so ruinously expensive that it's not logical for any nation to ever actually do it. Yet time and time again, nations find themselves embroiled in catastrophic wars, regardless of the illogic necessity of the situation.
I'm with Pete on that one. Despite how illogical it is, inevitably you'll have a nation state that thinks it benefits them no matter what the cost is. Like Russia right now is hemorrhaging funds. Their international currency is frozen. Their gas prices are down. Their refineries are attacked. Their workforce is diminishing. Their population is shrinking, and they're losing hundreds of soldiers every day in Ukraine. But somehow, some way, that's still worth it to them.
Sure.
I think the bigger question, and Pete pulled at this string earlier, was the use of automation. We've already seen the Russians use unmanned ground vehicles in Ukraine that were then in turn destroyed by Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicles, kamikaze drones. So we've had the first drone-on-drone combat. We've had drones fight each other in the air. It's only a matter of time till we get to drones fighting each other on the ground more often.
Yeah, this is what I was building to. It's just my brain's not working well these days. I was searching for a segue, but yeah, there's a couple layers to the cost, right, that have to be parsed apart. And part of what needs to be parsed, right, is that Pete's, your illustration of wars, there's always going to be war, relies on Russia. If there's one nation that is historically and culturally known to just kind of go, yeah, we've got more people. People are not that big of an expense. It's probably Russia.
Not also China?
Joseph Stalin is the one who coined the term. Quantity has a quality all its own, right?
Lenin, but yeah, you're on the right track. It's the fact that the Chinese never had to say that. It was just assumed.
So I'm not saying they're not the only ones, right? But I'm saying your example comes from one of those nations that does not really put an intrinsic cost on humans. Like it's a feudal era mentality, right? Like they're just peasants are just another commodity. We in the United States, in particular, definitely don't think that way. We've got a whole, I guess here, cocktail convo tip, right? Body bag syndrome was something that was being passed around for quite some time, especially after Vietnam. The idea that there's a physiological, emotional cost on the politicians that make the decisions to commit to war and on the people themselves seeing the number of casualties a war takes. And there's been a whole lot of research into, is there some way to justify making war worth it? And it gets into this whole really cool field of strategic narratives that is definitely worth doing a topic about later. Because we have this whole understudy of trying to, like, how do we sell this war in terms of the humans that will be having to sacrifice themselves in the name of this war? That doesn't exist for other countries. And I would argue that automation is definitely an American solution to some of these problems, because the more people you can remove from the risk equation, the more the decision to war or not to war becomes almost purely economical.
I would say also it removes accountability from elected officials if no people are dying as a result of their policy decisions.
Oh, absolutely. I think we've talked about that before too. It's who is most associated with the surgical strikes. I think most folks would recall President Obama being the one who more or less normalized those.
It's a whole post-Vietnam thing that the U.S. Army transitioned to the all-volunteer force, and then you took your combat capability and you put it in the National Guard, supposedly thinking that if you really want to fight a war, you're going to have to call up the National Guard, and as a result, you're going to have to get the entire population on board with this. However, with the War on Terror, we saw that you really don't need to, and even if you do, there's not a lot of backlash to doing so. But you're absolutely right to think about the costs at the highest level for that. And I do think that with automation and lower risk, you're going to see more of that. You already see it with standoff weapons. I mean, how much easier is it to launch a cruise missile strike?
Yeah, I think another thing that we are seeing now with the Ukraine war is that the United States has stumbled across a new type, a pseudo type of automation, and that is sanctioned state actor proxy. And what I mean by that is that we are in no small part providing substantial funding for Ukraine's own defense. And why are we doing that? Because it serves our interests against somebody that we have long viewed as an adversary. But we're pretty much fighting a war without having to fight the war because we don't have any boots on the ground. There is no intrinsic risk to Americans. And as a result of that, resistance to continuing aid support to Ukraine is going to reach a threshold at some point. Like, it's only money. And depending on where or how you view this Russian-Ukraine conflict, you might view this in terms of upholding democracy, right? And sovereignty and all of these other ideals we talked about as being intrinsically dear to America. Or you might view it as somebody else's war. But in either case, risk, reward, benefit, right? Are you losing that much by contributing to it? What you can literally put a dollar price on what America is currently is fighting this war with Ukraine with, right?
Well, yeah, you can, because the most common political argument against it is that, oh, well, we could be spending this money on border security. That's what you hear most from the Republicans, right? Just like, oh no, it's not personnel we're spending here. Again, it's just pure money, and it's not something that the Republicans were particularly upset about before, obviously. But that's not the
I
hypocrisy is
mean,
not the point.
the DoD has never passed an audit anyways. So like we're like when you say it's only money, like this is a systemic argument across our executive branch.
Oh, and you look at it too. Only about a third of the money in the recent bill for Ukraine is actually direct aid to Ukraine. The rest is rebuilding capabilities in the United States and buying more equipment. I mean, we're buying JASSM missiles with this money. None of those JASSM missiles are going to Ukraine, I guarantee it. What is going to go to Ukraine are the older ATACMS missiles that we're taking out of service and replacing with the JASSMs.
Yeah, I mean, again, when you can boil down conflict to just a pure risk reward monetary thing, it makes a lot of sense. You're not like we're simultaneously clearing out some of our more dated stuff and rearming ourselves with some newer stuff. But at the same time, like you mentioned the border crisis, but yeah, there's definitely other competing defense requirements. But how do you balance those? Like there's this now we're talking about very 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 subjectively valued values, right?
So if America puts as Matt already said, if we put an unfathomable cost or price on our soldiers, and the Russians put functionally zero cost on their soldiers, even fighting by proxy, how can we possibly beat them?
That's you guys both said, well, you both didn't say shut up, Joe, you're wrong. But I said earlier, at some point you're going to reach a point where you literally feel like wars are not worth fighting. And you both went like, no. But it really seems like the United States might be reaching that point, to the point where our old volunteer force is struggling emphatically to recruit the numbers of volunteers it needs to meet what it's projected as the requirements to defend our nation.
That's an interesting point, though, especially with the Gaza debacle
I
that
make
the
them
Israelis are in
sometimes
right now, and then
What was the point?
the 1-2 punch of Iraq and Afghanistan. It's like, yeah, the army
Yeah.
cannot catch a break.
I would say it's interesting. Pete brought up Gaza, so I'll switch there slightly while still on the value of a soldier. You mentioned that. I think you come at it from two angles. You have state actors, which look at things empirically, or at least with some degree of logic, however callous it may be in the Russians' case. But when you get to ideologically motivated authorities, groups, movements, you look at that, I think the human cost is irrelevant. You look at a terrorist organization like Hamas, they are cogs in the machine. There is no value per se, because they are there for one purpose, and to execute that purpose to its fullest extent. So I think the struggle, and you alluded to this earlier, Joe, and I like where you're going with it, is how does a country like the United States, with values, with costs, with morals and everything else, and with a presumed value on an individual soldier, fight someone who, my life has no value. It doesn't matter what happens and no one cares. It's it almost reminds me of Starship Troopers and the bugs versus the Starship Troopers. There's always going to be more bugs. And I'm not trying to say anyone's a bug, but the value of each one of those Starship Troopers is worth a heck of a lot more than any of the bugs, but they still have to fight. Sorry to swing us all the way over that way.
But I did appreciate the Starship Troopers reference.
Yeah, but I mean, there's only one of two ways. There's essentially the two different directions you can take it. What do you both keep staring at?
I got the draft on for Stacy so she can watch and be entertained.
What's the draft?
The NFL draft, not your draft, because we have an all-volunteer army, thank God.
Mm-hmm.
But you can talk about the worth of a first-round pick.
But there's two directions you can take with this values-based assessment, right? One is you find a way to protect your investment. How can you protect all that money you've put into that? Well, with really, really sophisticated armaments and potentially automation to remove them from that direct line of fire. Alternatively, you lower the cost. How do you do that? Well, you probably can't, as long as the soldiers you are talking about that are fighting for America are Americans who have volunteered to defend America.
So far, though, Jay, we've been really utilitarian and materialistic about this worth. What about the will? Harkening back to my MVP, my greatest of all time, Karl von Clausewitz, saying that you need to conquer an enemy's will in order for him to be defeated.
Yeah, so a lot of that body bag research that I was talking about earlier, a lot of what it's trying to do is quantify that willpower. And it quantifies that willpower as a risk reward sum based around trying to determine when is a life spent in a war considered worth it.
An interesting thing I was actually reading recently about the American advance into Germany in early 1945. And by that point, no one wanted to be the last person to die in the war in Europe. So you can look at how the value of a life changes over the course of the war. It's the height of the war in 1944. We've landed in Normandy, Operation Overlord. The will is much greater at that point than it's late April of 45, and I'm fighting some holdout Hitler Youth in Volkstrom. I really don't want to die at this point. I'm just going to call out artillery on this village or call it an airstrike. The will has changed. I think over the course of the war in Ukraine, you've seen the will change as well. I mean, the Ukrainians are finally lowering the conscription age down to, I believe, 25 now, or is it 27?
I think 25 is it. But then there's also the whole mobilization still hasn't been signed yet by Zelensky because it's too unpopular. I think it's like another, 200,000 men?
Yes. Whereas you're exacting a greater toll on a lesser portion of the population. It's the same problem the American army had at the height of the war on terror. How do we fight something that's deeply unpopular with a limited segment of the population? And I think Russia doesn't have that because no matter what someone's will is, it's subservient to the state. You're just going to be crushed like a bug if you try and fight back against it. There was a picture of a Russian that tried to handcuff himself to a railing rather than be taking the war in Ukraine. And he was on a bus and they cut off the railing and it was still handcuffed to his arm heading there.
Modern problems require modern solutions.
This cuts both ways too, though, right? Like somebody's going to fight a lot harder if they're fighting something they believe in. And yeah, in World War II, our first bombing campaign started out with, let's strategically target factories and stuff because unnecessary loss of human life and collateral damage is probably not going to be conducive to the war effort. Whereas then you switch over to the Pacific theater and they just say, full send it, boys, to flatten everything.
Yeah, we switched from high altitude precision bombing to let's take off all the guns and turrets that we don't need, fly low level, and carry as many incendiaries as possible.
How can we make this burn more? And so maybe part of that was part of that fatigue as well. But also there's that at home fatigue from being under that constant pressure. And at some point, a lot of salesmanship comes into the media for this as well, at least for the United States. And we've seen this going at least as far back as the War of 1812, where even small wins get just super inflated into sounding like they were major victories, and it keeps the bloodlust going at home.
You're talking about the handful of frigate duels the U.S. Navy actually won during the War of 1812?
In the first year, yes, when we were winning, and then we won in air quotes 2 or 3 land engagements during the second year of the war, when our Navy was getting everybody but the USS Constitution was getting trounced.
The USS Chesapeake.
Yeah, not a good.
And then the third year of the war featured the whole burning of the Capitol thing, and then the Treaty of Ghent.
Right.
Followed shortly by Andrew Jackson winning the only decisive victory that we had during that war after peace was already agreed upon.
Well, no, we hadn't ratified it yet, dude. War was still ongoing.
No, it was ratified. They hadn't gotten the message to him. But that's not how we remember it. We remember, Andrew Jackson won the Battle of New Orleans and we won the War of 1812, when in reality, the terms of the peace was status quo antebellum. So the way things were before war was declared, and considering we were the aggressor in that war and we declared the war, that means we literally achieved nothing.
Oh, be fair. We declared after literally years of British provocation against American merchant ships.
And
And also, I would say
you start peeling back that onion, it's actually not how that worked.
stop hating on your boy TJ so much, dude. Also,
It wasn't TJ.
and I'm sure Matt will back me up on this. If you're
it
a minor
was-
country taking
It
on
was Madison.
if you're a minor country taking on the largest sea power on the planet, I think status quo antebellum's we count that as a win, right?
All right. They were literally holding France in a headlock at the time, and we ran up behind them and proverbially kicked them between the legs and then say, yeah, go us.
The fact that we came out with status quo is somewhat of a win. I've got to back Pete there. It could have been a lot worse.
Could have been way worse, man. We could be all speaking
Okay,
Canadian.
but that is bifurcating the victory and making it a relative success. Because you're right. If they had continued, it could only have gotten worse from there. So we are lucky that they altered the deal, and we prayed they don't alter it further.
All right, Darth. So if we move on from there and we kind of look at some of the other wars in American history and the value of a life, it's interesting when you look at that with, I don't know, take World War I, for example, where you kind of see the draft hit home hard, or World War II, where everyone's in favor of the draft. But then you have Korea, and I think the real transition is Vietnam in American society, because Korea is the last war that's fought by all of American society. I mean, you have Harvard graduates, Yale, everybody goes to fight. Ted Williams is mobilized. He goes to fight. He flies planes for the Navy. You get to Vietnam, and all of a sudden, if you're in college, if you have a family, if you're this, if you're that, there's any number of exemptions. And we've got the Warriors' worth here. I mean, the Warrior caste is really born in Vietnam, in my opinion.
Along with the professional American military, well, the modern professional all-volunteer force. Because the core of those Vietnam vets are the ones who go on to form the Army of the 80s.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at McNamara's Folly or McNamara's 100,000, where we take people with not as high IQs and try to draft them, obviously McNamara had a lower worth of some Americans within society other than other ones. But coming out of Vietnam is where you see the United States Army start going down this lane where we become much more casualty averse. And we have not had to fight a large-scale war like the Ukrainians, the Russians are fighting right now. I'm not quite sure what would happen if we did, because the casualties would be worse than the worst years of Iraq.
Oh.
Mm-hmm.
So, circling back to what I was saying, what I had put out there earlier is like, you can either protect your investment or lower the cost of your investment, right? When it comes to these American soldiers. So I said you could protect your investment by automation or better armaments and all these other things. But the other way, you can decrease the investment. But I had said that it was hard to do when the investment you're talking about is Americans volunteering their lives, right?
I think you reach a certain threshold where you can't devalue it at that point. You so to speak, cross the Rubicon of human.
Unless they're not American volunteers anymore.
That's different.
I'm just saying.
It's the same with
Pete,
the ANA and the ANP.
What is the dead fish stare? What is the dead eye fish stare for, Pete? I'm just saying private military corporations is one of them.
I mean, I can tell you my second deployment in Afghanistan, when I was over there, the U.S. presence had been greatly reduced at that point. And we would have our weekly meetings in Kabul, and they would go down the list of coalition casualties. And on a given week, there might be one or usually zero coalition casualties. And then they would go through all the names for the ANA and the ANP, dozens, if not over 100 every week. So obviously it goes back to that equation you talked about, Joe, where you lower your investment by employing someone else to do what you don't want to do.
And so this is how late stage republic we have gotten, having foreigners fight all our wars for us.
Okay, well, I mean, this is starting to sound a little more critical than I had intended. I was just suggesting that maybe it's time to consider a healthy competitive market space for private military corporations to compensate for the lack of the all volunteers we have, if we're still if expeditionary military engagements is something that is still on the docket, right? But I don't think it's fair to say that other foreigners are fighting America's war for them, because part of part of the war in Ukraine, right, is still part of this narrative of a sovereign nation that is being invaded. And that requires accepting that the United States doesn't just have those icky values of realism that are directly tied. Matt, I don't know if you've listened to much of the episodes before, but I usually find some way to kick realism. And this is mine right here for this episode. It's like, just because America is not being, in some ways, Pete, this is not America's fight in Ukraine, especially in realist tendencies, because our physical security requirements and interests are not being threatened by them. But ideally, right, free world order, somebody needs to help support it. That's the whole point of democracy is people are being expected to work with and lean on other people. And in that sense, yeah, the war in Ukraine is something that is tied to U.S. interests. But that again comes down to which values you accept as being valuable.
I think you'd have to go all the way to tertiary American interests. If you read the National Security Strategy, it always talks about promoting democracy out throughout the world. So defending democracy would be along the same vein or the same sort of line of effort, in my opinion. But I do think you're right about that, Joe. It just comes back to how do you sell that to the American public? And I think we've seen some really, without getting too much into politics, diverse takes on that from both sides of the political aisle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we definitely, the next episode, we should really do body bag syndrome and talk about strategic narratives.
You can go all the way back to the Civil War for that, with the draft riots in Baltimore and New York.
No, it's, again, America is one of the, was one of a kind. It was the first nation that was, in theory at least, founded on purely on ideals. Right? It did not have a nationality requirement intrinsically written into its constitution. Yes, Pete, I know we have argued about this before, off camera, but in theory, America was one of its kind because it required everybody to agree to be a part of this nation. What were we just talking about, gents? I completely lost my train of thought.
Body bag syndrome.
Body bags, yeah. And because of that, because this is all based off of individuals having the right to choose and the right to decide and the right to choose the values that they will charge with other things, the media has had an intrinsic role in how conflicts, whether internal or external, have been perceived since the start of this nation. The newspapers tell mostly a complimentary, but oftentimes a radically different side of the story to every American conflict.
Do you think the Romans had a similar problem with this after the Second Punic War? Right after the massive casualties at Lake Cannae and Zama.
I blame the printing. It's the printing press. Now it's the internet. It was the printing press. Now it's the internet. The stuff can travel too fast now.
I think you flatten society too much, to Joe's point. I mean, looking at the stuff coming out of Ukraine now, the images we saw out of Somalia and during the American intervention there, Restore Hope was Haiti. What was Somalia?
Urgent Fury?
Urgent Fury was Panama.
No, Somalia was something Hope.
Gothic Serpent?
It was something Hope.
Oh, Restore Hope.
Restore Hope.
Yes, I think it was Restore Hope. Anyways, the images of American soldiers being dragged through the streets with their bodies, or, it's enough to make us pull out of that conflict. You go to body bag syndrome, Joe, right there. What's happening now in Ukraine, where not only are people being killed by FPVs, the first-person view drones, which are essentially kamikazes, their deaths are recorded for posterity. There's a guy on Twitter, Andrew Perpetua, who looks at all these and goes through thousands of videos every day, and he's able to catalog the number of drone attacks. There were, I think, 1,300 individual drone attacks against Russian soldiers in the month of March, the last one was recorded data on. It's probably 1,300 fatalities or 1,300 at least grievous woundings. Yeah, the idea of Americans and that being filmed would not go over well with the American public.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because at least the Russian can control tightly the media that's going out. Yeah, they have Telegram. Yeah, there's leaks going through. But in general, patriotic Russians aren't going to watch that. Or if they are, they're going to be like, oh, it's all fake.
It's all direct propaganda.
Yeah, oh, no, those are actually Ukrainians wearing Russian uniforms or something like that.
Whereas you look at that, or you look at in 2004 with, I Fallujah with the contractor who were burned and their bodies hung upside down off the bridge. That was enough for us to go retake Fallujah and launch at the most comprehensive ground battle since the Battle of Hue in Vietnam over that. I mean, if that hadn't happened and Fallujah had just dissolved into anarchy, I guarantee you would not have expended the effort we did to take back that city.
Mhm.
So yeah, absolutely, Joe. The effect of body bag syndrome on American media and how we perceive that. It's interesting. Another one that happened relatively recently was when the ODAA in Niger came under attack, and one of them actually filmed on his GoPro their end. As terrible as it was, and all of a sudden you had people in Congress saying, "I can't believe we're in Niger. I didn't know about this," even though they'd probably been through a number of intelligence briefings they either neglected to attend or didn't listen to about U.S. forces in Niger.
But here's the thing, though. So you listed off both Somalia and then Fallujah, two radically different knee-jerk responses to seeing dead American soldiers. So is there like either a overwhelming like retaliation or the withdrawal of forces, right, based on the death scene? Is there some kind of indication that we could then pull from that as to seeing which reaction you would get from America? Is it like a certain amount of death, you get the withdrawal, but then too much or too gratuitous, you get the reaction?
This is all research questions that people have been trying to answer. I will say that part of the story is like Restore Hope was not supposed to be a military operation. So any amount of loss was already not going to be received well. Fallujah happened in the middle of an ongoing war. So different reaction there. The Niger thing, again, we were surprised to learn that there was any sort of military operation that was happening there to begin with at all. So, of course, we're upset that we lost these people. We didn't even know they were there. Why the hell were they there? Why the heck were they there?
Yeah, all very different reactions to a similar situation when you talk about the body bag syndrome. So I think it's very time and space dependent upon where we are, what the conflict is, where the conflict is definitely matters more.
I mean, remember the Alamo, right? Pretty much get got to the man, and yet that's a battle cry, not a point of shame.
That's because nobody filmed how Jim Bowie and Davy Crockett died. Doesn't ruin the story.
Okay. You don't think them defending, holding the Alamo honorably, and then having their body cam footage showing them getting scalped or whatever, wouldn't have just pissed more people off?
I don't know. But like Matt was saying,
Exactly.
the flattening of society,
No.
I feel like it's different now.
I mean, it's certainly a generational thing as well. I'm sure different Americans would react differently to these outcomes for sure.
Well, part of it's
But
how much of a
ultimately,
big deal the media or the prevailing powers want to make of it. I mean, the USS Panay is bombed and sunk by the Japanese in 1937. American sailors are killed by the Japanese, and we take some hush money and here, we're so sorry this happened, even though it was blatantly marked. Please take our money and don't blow us out of oblivion. 2 years later, 4 years later, completely different story.
We weren't ready for war yet, though, in 37. Not even close. That was another reason to take the money and run.
But that shows that in an era where you don't have the flattening of society, you can really cover that up if you want to. I don't think you can today. It's not Russia, it's not China where our internet's restricted, no matter what we're going to do with TikTok or whatever else it is. If there's a video out there, eventually it's going to make its way from Telegram or TikTok to Twitter to some other platform, and eventually it'll hit the mainstream media.
Yeah, and they have to cover it, because if they don't, they'll lose clicks, no matter how damaging it is.
No, the media outlets are a business, and they might be trying to provide a valuable service to society, but at the end of the day, they have a bottom line to look after as well.
And horrible stories tell.
We always end on such uplifting notes.
Not really. We usually just end abruptly and awkwardly.
This would be a great place for you to smash cut.